In this video, I'll talk about preferments and then I'll demonstrate mixing a kind of preferment called a poolish. Preferments are mixtures of dough that get made ahead of time, a day or so before you mix your dough. They rise, for several hours or even overnight, and the chemical reactions begin and flavor begins to develop. And then when you mix your dough, you add the preferment. So this does a few things for your dough. One is it adds flavor, especially if the preferment has been rising for many, many hours. The chemical reactions start, and this means that the acidity develops in the preferment. Acidity causes the proteins that are in there to unravel. There are the enzymes that get to work, and so all of the start of all these reactions means that once you start kneading your dough, it will be easier to knead it to a fully kneaded state. And finally, because a portion of the flour in your recipe has already reacted from being in the preferment, you can use less total yeast in your recipe. There are many different kinds of preferments. Possibly the most famous is sourdough starter. So sourdough starter, here's mine. This one was fed last night, so it's not totally fully risen. I put it in the fridge after a few hours. But basically, sourdough starter is this mixture that is sort of continuously being fed and rising, and you never use all of it. You always save a little bit. So the fact that it's just been fermenting and fermenting for so long means that a bunch of flavor has developed in it. And when you use it in your bread recipe, that flavor goes into your bread. There are also preferments made with yeast. And in this case, you would mix up your preferment, you'd let it rise, and then use the whole thing in your bread recipe. You wouldn't have to save some the way you do with the sourdough starter. So for example, last night I mixed up a poolish and it rose overnight. This morning it didn't have quite as many bubbles as I like, and it didn't look like it was all full of gas. And I realized that my house was only 65 degrees, so it had been 70, but the temperature had dropped outside. So I just let the poolish keep rising, and I put it on top of the toaster oven and turned the toaster oven on for a few minutes, and that made it nice and warm. And being in that warm place and having the extra rising time, the poolish kept going and ended up looking nice and bubbly and ready to use. Preferments can have different consistencies. Sometimes they'll be soupy like a pancake batter, and then other times they'll be more dough-like and stiff. Some people have opinions on these two consistencies and which one might have which kind of flavor. In the bakery where I worked, we originally made a soupy preferment for a lot of our doughs, and we mixed those by hand, and at some point it just became too much, so we switched to a more dough-like consistency so we could mix them in the mixer, and I did not notice a change in our breads when we made that switch. You'll also encounter a lot of different names for preferments. Some you might hear are poolish, biga, sponge, chef, levain, and again, different people use them differently, and I have not found any consistency. So where I worked, we used poolish for a yeasted mixture that was a very wet consistency, and we used sponge or biga for a yeasted mixture that was drier, and then we used levain and starter for our sourdough starter. But sometimes you'll see a recipe that has a starter in it and it's a yeasted mixture. You might find some places differentiate between the starter that you keep in your fridge and then the part that you take out and mix to put in your dough, and one is the starter and one is the levain, but then I've seen those two switched, so there really is not any consistency, and I would just say don't assume something because of the name. Just make sure you read the recipe and figure out what it's telling you to do. So if you'd like to try a simple recipe that uses a preferment, there's a recipe for a French baguette with a poolish on my website. If you have a recipe you like and you want to try making it with a preferment and it doesn't have one, you can adjust it so that you mix part of it the day ahead. So basically, you would cut the total yeast in the recipe to 2/3. Then you would mix the poolish using 1/3 of the flour in your recipe, an equal amount of water, and a pinch of yeast. So mix that up, let it rise overnight, and it should double or even triple in height and be all full of gas. And then the next day, you mix the remaining ingredients. So that would be 2/3 of the original flour, whatever the original water was minus the amount you used, and then 2/3 of the original yeast. Mixing a poolish is easy. So I have my flour, I've already weighed it out. Make sure you use a container that is big enough that the poolish will be able to double or even triple in size without overflowing. Then you're going to add a pinch of yeast. Different people have different finger sizes, so if you have a really little pinch, you might want to do 2. And then I usually just mix the yeast up into the flour. So then as far as the water goes, we're shooting for a final temperature around 75 degrees. And the temperature of the poolish is going to be affected by the room temperature, the flour and water temperature, and also how much friction is involved when you mix it. So I went for 70-degree water because I mentioned before my house is a little bit cold today. But that's a little bit of a guess because I haven't done this in a while. So we'll just see how it turns out. So this recipe is 193 grams of water. I'm using a separate container in case I go over. And then you just add the water to your flour and stir. So you want to get all the lumps out. If you leave any lumps in it, what will happen is the water will soak into them, but they won't, because they're not mixed up, they'll end up being these sort of little rock-like hard bits in your mixture. And once you have them, it's pretty impossible to get rid of them. So just keep mixing until you don't see any more lumps of flour. So here's my finished poolish. You can see it's a little bit on the cold side, and I think the reason is I forgot that the glass bowl was pretty cold because it's the temperature of my house, and that probably added a lot of coldness to my poolish. But never fear, if it had turned out 75, it would rise and be ready to use in about 12 to 14 hours. So because it's a little on the cold side, I could let it rise longer and bake later in the day tomorrow, or I can try to put it somewhere warm. So, the top of your fridge sometimes has heat coming up from the back, and that can be warm. The top of your stove, especially if I use my oven to make dinner tonight, that would be another warm spot. Or I could do what I did today, which was just let it rise overnight, and then tomorrow you put it on top of the toaster oven and give it a little boost to get it rising a little bit more before I use it. If your poolish turns out too hot, I would just try to put it somewhere low down in the room, even on the floor. If there's a safe place, you can put it down on the floor because it's colder down there, and that should slow it down. And finally, you'll want to cover your poolish. But keep in mind that it will be fermenting and producing gas. So you don't want to have a cover that's on so tightly that you cause some kind of explosion. So a plastic lid, if it can puff out a little bit, that usually works. Or you can use plastic wrap with a rubber band. I'll probably just rest this on top but not have it on too tightly so that a little bit of gas can escape.